Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Josivan Nascimento, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Language and Literature graduate program at the Federal University of Piauí. It's an absolute pleasure for me to serve as the chairman for the keynote speaker to teaching Shakespeare and other terrifying texts, a simple technique at the nexus of literature and linguistics, to be delivered by Dr. Linda Shenk, who has a PhD from the University of Minnesota, MA from University of Alaska, and BA from James Madison University. Dr. Linda Chang is an associate professor at the literature program in English department at Iowa State University, where she teaches Shakespeare and other modern literature. Her research areas focus on early modern drama, particularly Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth I as a learned queen, late 16th century international politics and diplomacy, storytelling, participatory action research, resilient sustainable cities. Linda too is interested in creating a transdisciplinary and pragmatic space as an engaged humanist. She applies her background in storytelling to how we incorporate certain types of simulation models, such as agent-based models, into community engagement. Working with stakeholders, particularly with underrepresented populations, she approaches agent-based models as fellow storytellers, using the model's what-if scenarios to spark agency and action projects. As a scholar, Shanks examines the way in which narrative participates both lightheartedly and pragmatically in a real-world situation, and this balance of pragmatics, fun, and analysis rests at the center of her teaching. The background in the theory allows her to do creative staging activities with classes, but she also has developed particular reading techniques that translate into effective strategies for writing and giving presentations across disciplines. Now, I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Shank, thanking her voluntarily for her voluntary participation in our Piauí-Iowa Conference on Language and Literature. You have 6 minutes for your speech, then we will open this session for questions and comments of our attendees watching us on the PPGEL UFPI YouTube channel. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome, and thank you. Thank you, Josifan, for the lovely introduction and for all of your good humor and spirit as you communicated with me about this presentation today. So thank you for all you've done, and thank you also, Beatriz, for your work in kind of doing the technology end of this, that kind of silent work that maybe others don't know you're actually doing right now. So thank you to you. And then my last is just thank you to all of you who are here. I just really appreciate this. And I really appreciate this conference with its focus on academic learning without borders, with an emphasis on working across national differences, linguistic differences, and even kind of subdisciplinary boundaries. I'm really delighted to be a part of this. And I've enjoyed the sessions I've been able to kind of listen in on. I've enjoyed the discussions of translation, discussions of literature of the Global South, and also Global South. I loved the image of taking the continent of South America and turning it upside down. That was great. As well as Professor Beckett's keynote on project-based learning. So just thank you for this really rich array of aspects of conversation that have happened. So today, I want to share with you a simple technique that I use in my teaching that gives students a concrete and feasible entry point into what can be terrifying texts. Whether those texts be terrifying because of the complexity of the language, like I teach Shakespeare, or if it is because of those texts are terrifying because they're in a language other than our students' native language. So I teach Shakespeare, as you can tell by my title and Josifan's introduction. And when students sign up for my Shakespeare class, some of them are indeed terrified. because they are sure that they are taking a class in what might as well be a foreign language. And indeed, Shakespeare is written in early modern English, but that is hardly Middle English, or even harder still, Old English, or even, for me, Portuguese. So in fact, I'm even meant to say at the beginning, hola, boa tarde. Boa tarde, sorry, got that wrong. And hello and good afternoon. So I actually had practiced just a little bit, then I just messed it up. Okay. So what I want to share today, and just when I'll get to my to the next slide in just a minute, so just hang here, it's perfect. No, actually just go back. That's pretty good to where you were before. Yeah, that's great. Nope, actually the second one. What I want to share today is in the spirit of this academic learning without borders. It's a simple technique that I developed first for using in my Shakespeare classroom. But now I use it in all of my classes, my literature classes, my writing classes, and even in some of those odd aspects of the introduction that Josivan mentioned, of that I do storytelling and I now do participatory action research. I also have interest with literature and diplomacy. So it's all these kind of like, how do we bring different languages together? The language of research and the language of communities, the language of different nations as they work through foreign policy. And then even for our students, how do we get them an entry point into some very complex situations linguistically for them? So that's always at the center, is very much this idea of learning without borders. So I just really appreciate that. And so when I use this technique, I use it as an entry point for us to think about, how do we study texts and discourse with a range of expertise that we all here today are bring together: literary and cultural analysis, linguistics, pedagogy, and perhaps even for some of you, rhetoric. So today, Josivan, you can go to the next slide. Today, to give you a quick sense of the trajectory, this is what I'm going to share first, just the technique itself, which is really simple, and I want to call it something simple. I call it speaking the same language. And for my students, and I refer to it as SSL. So that way it's a really fast thing. It's very similar to discourse analysis. Those of you will be like, this sounds a lot like discourse analysis. It has elements, very strong elements of that, because it is connected to kind of conversation and exchange. I use that term because it's also very simple, so it has that less sense of threatening or intimidating to students. Then after that, I'll share one, maybe I'm hoping 2 examples, definitely the one from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a very famous scene. You'll be like, oh yeah, yeah. And then I want to connect speaking the same language to techniques for some of these different aspects of work that we all bring together: rhetorical analysis, thinking about strategies of persuasion and rhetorical figures; discourse analysis. Particularly, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on politeness theory, not so much on speech acts, but that's also a part of this works very well with, as well as the cooperation principle. And then literary analysis, imagery, rhyme, literary form, connotation. And then finally, I'll link this to wider applications, particularly effective written and oral communications. So let's go ahead and get started. So with speaking the same language, it's so easy. It's so simple. There's 3 central questions. The first one is, when students read a text, for example, like in a Shakespeare play, which is conversation, of course, the first thing that I ask them to look for literally is what words are repeated. As literally, they just repeat the same words back and forth. It's like a ball that they toss back and forth. What do those words suggest about the common or contested ground of these 2 characters? And how does it convey their values? The second question after that is then, okay, well, then these words that are shared, how are they passed back and forth, like that image of a ball? Do they have the same meaning when they're passed back and forth? Are they referring to the same thing, the same referent? Does one speaker accept that meaning and that form, or do they change it when they pass it back? And then the third thing is, what functions are happening within this exchange? Are these characters cooperating? Are they requesting something of each other, thinking of speech acts? Are they issuing a directive, another speech act type thing? Are they making or avoiding face-threatening acts with or without redressive action? Are they persuading? Are they abusing? And that abuse really does kind of trickle into all those other pieces as well. So let's just stay right here for just a minute. And then, so what's nice about this is it starts with something as simple as repeating words. But what that is like, it's like a gradual entry pool. You can start simply with noticing what words are repeated. Students don't have to have any background in literature or linguistics or the other language, right? They just need to notice what words are repeated. That's it. But it's like a gradual entry pool. If you look closer there at that thing, you'll see that there's some young children there closer to the kind of that little shallow. It's a zero, like a zero entry. They also call it pool. But then you see then others that have waded in further and further and further. So the more questions you ask of this technique, the deeper in one can go. So that's why I like it. It allows for differentiated learning. So students can pick it up at any point and then go in as deep as they're ready. And so that's something that I found really helpful. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just jump in. So on the first day, I did this on the first day of class. And on the very first day, I asked them as a preface to this idea of speaking the same language, I asked them first who in real life speaks a common language. And of course, we get issues like, actual like identified languages like Portuguese and English and French and Swahili and all those different languages. Then some of the students then move in like, well, also there's regional differences. Like in our country, is it a bag or is it a sack? Is it a soda or is it a pop? Then they sometimes like to play with generation languages, like my parents and I do not speak the same language. Then they also will look too at like how very close friends will speak a common language, how they, when they're in a major, how their own major or later on their own profession has its own language. The military is famous for having its own language, right? All these acronyms that, half of us don't understand. And then of course, it's really fun. Then someone usually says, well, like, couples. And I'm like, right. So I said, okay, who are the most famous lovers in all of literature? And obviously you have right in front of you the kind of standard example, which is Romeo and Juliet. So what I do on the first day of class is I tend to tell them I actually have them get into pairs and they read aloud this exchange. It's the first time that Romeo and Juliet have met, if you will, in the play. This is their first exchange. And I just ask them to read it aloud together. One is Romeo, one is Juliet. And then they're to go through and circle all the words that Romeo and Juliet pass back and forth. That's all I asked them to do at the beginning. So let's just take a minute. We'll look at this particular passage. I guess I should emphasize too that when I tell them to do this, I tell them don't do the stage directions. And if you look down to the lower right-hand corner, you'll see one of the reasons why. So I'm like, don't do the stage directions. And they kind of giggle and it's nice. Okay, so let's just look at it for just a minute. I'll read it. I won't like act it, but I'll read it. So Romeo starts. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this gentle shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too? Ay, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, though grant, for prayer's sake. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. So Joseph, you can go to the next slide. Oh, nope, actually just back where you were. Oh my goodness. They have such an intimate, tight language as they pass words back and forth. I went through and did a little highlight on all the words that they pass back and forth. So we have, well, actually, yeah. So they pass back and forth these words: hand, pilgrims, touch, all of them. So it's incredibly intimate. So I'll say, so do they speak the same language? And they're like, yes. I was like, Yes, they do. So then we move now to the next slide, and we'll talk about what I then do next with them. I'm like, okay, so now call out to me, students, not you all, don't worry. Call out to me, what are the words that you notice that they share? So Josivan, if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So then they call them out, and in the old style of it, I write it on the board. Yeah, with chalk, whole thing. Hands, lips, touch, saints, palmers, grant. Oh, oops, I put grant twice. Holy, pilgrim, pilgrims, kiss, palm, pray, and prayer, move. So I then say my next question, to get to my second question, so first of all, these are the words that they share. So then I ask them, okay, so if these are the words that show their common ground and their values, what can we learn from those words? Like, and so what I have them do, Joseph, and I can go to the next slide, is I have them put them in sort of into categories. I'm like, okay, so if we had to have types of words here, what would those types or those categories be? So then they're like, well, they're usually like physical words. And so then we kind of go through and we just, so like hands, lips, touch, kiss, and yeah, also religious words, holy, pilgrims, saints, prayer, palmers. So we start with that. And I say, okay, so this would be the moment. This technique works really well with students who are not native speakers. One of my former students teaches non-native speakers, and she uses this technique in her class. Or like with her a whole range of her students, and she finds it useful because what she does then at this moment is she has the students look up or make sure that they know the meanings of these words. So that way, it already, again, what sometimes is terrifying about a text is the fact that it's incredibly complex, and there's something about it that's very overwhelming. So this takes the really complex aspects of Romeo and Juliet, of Shakespeare's text to begin with, and then now narrows it down to something that's a little more manageable. So after they kind of do that kind of categorizing, or if it's students too that really need to spend some time with definitions. I mean, I do that also just in my classes with native speakers, because again, most of them don't know necessarily what a palm or what a palm is, like for going on a pilgrimage or a pilgrim. And so they need to kind of look at that. And there's notes usually that I provide for them so they know what that means. But then what I have them do is say, okay, so now let's look a little deeper. So we understand already. So how do they feel about love? How do they feel about religion? What are their values? And so someone will say, well, they're very aware of like virtue and goodness. And so they see sort of love as like holy, as having a spiritual element, that kind of bringing together those things. So at the same time, they really have physicality going on too. And I'm like, yeah, they're teenagers. This is called hormones. So they play around with that. I'm like, okay, so now let's look a little even deeper still. If we look at the physicality, what kinds of physical things are happening? And they said, well, it's all really rather kind of innocent, right? It's hands, also palms. Not only the palm that a palmer takes, back from pilgrimage, but also palm is in terms of the hand. It's kiss, it's lips, so that it's touch, but there's nothing particularly crass about it. It's all very, it's all like upper parts of the body. So it's very kind of innocent and sweet. Yes. Then we look at the religion part of it. And I'm like, okay, what kind of religion do we have here? And then they'll usually say Christianity. I say, right. Can we get more specific than that? Catholic. This is Catholicism. I'm like, right. So then already what they're doing is they're moving into kind of a tighter space, looking at the nuance a little bit, all within a territory that's a lot easier for them to kind of get their heads around. So we do some work with that. So Josivan, if you can go to the next slide, that would be great. So then the last kind of piece of this, or not the last, but like the next big piece of this is how do they pass the words back and forth? So I've highlighted in red the very first word that Juliet picks up from Romeo, and that's the word pilgrim. And so with this particular moment, I asked them, I'm like, okay, so first of all, is it the same word? And they're like, well, I mean, yes. But then I'm like, okay, are they referring to the same thing? And this is the moment where there's usually some hesitation. This is the first day of class, and they're like, no. I'm like, okay, well, what does Romeo mean by it? His lips. I'm like, right. And so if his lips are pilgrims, what are they doing? They're moving in. I'm like, right, here come the lips, right? They're pilgrims. Here they go on pilgrimage. So already we get the sense of what he's doing with it. Now, then I say, okay, so Juliet picks up that idea of pilgrim. Does she mean his lips? And they're like, no, she means him. She's referring to him as a pilgrim. And I said, oh, so same word, different referent. What's going on there? So then they start saying, well, she's slowing him down. She's like, well, easy. But she's doing it in a really nice way. She's doing it in terms of that she's still emphasizing that he's virtuous, that he's good, that he's a part of this process of kind of devoted Catholic practice. So we do those things. And then this can be a moment, I don't do it on the first day of class, but if I was a little deeper into the semester, I'll then start introducing, for those of you out there who are like, politeness theory, Linda, hello. This is the moment where I bring up politeness theory, because this is a moment that she's rejecting him a little bit. She's holding him back. So this is a potentially face-threatening act. What is actually, it's very low in kind of its extreme nature. It's not extreme. It's a very kind of low impact face-threatening act. And it's also, but what she does is she does the face-threatening act. She does say slow down, essentially, but she does it with a beautiful sense of kind of addressing what in politeness theory is called positive face. It's that sense of what are those characteristics that you want for yourself as well as in others, right? Virtue, health, honor, a good reputation, and those are all coming from Brown and Gilman, of course. So she does it by emphasizing his virtue, right? So she does the face-threatening act, and she does it in a way, though, that's lovely, that kind of gently just pushes him back, but in still a very kind of positive politeness kind of way. So we have that. We can see that just in how they speak that same language. Then we can see how smart she is, because she picks up the idea of pilgrim and also the idea of hand, and even the idea of holy up there. She's kind of takes that as a hovering idea. And then she plays with the idea of saints. She introduces that idea. Saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, right? So she moves away from the lips. She's now situating this in this idea of hands now, okay? Now we're going to move to this kind of kiss. It's very strategic, and we can watch how she redirects it in how she passes the words back and forth. Okay, Josivan, you can go to the next one. That would be lovely. Okay. We then watch how then after that, Romeo goes back to the idea too of the kiss, but he still wants to kind of connect it. Not so much this. He keeps her idea of palm and palmers, but now he brings in this idea that all of them have lips, right? So he brings it back to his initial request through that shared language in a very kind of respectful way, but always with this idea of positive politeness, the idea of that he does it in a way that is always keeping her within that virtue that's very important to her. So he completely honors that and respects it. And we can see that sense of respect on both of their parts if we look at politeness theory and we bring in that element. Let's see. Josivan, if you could do the next one, that would be great. So this is all still on the first day of class. So I'm getting them to look at the specific meanings of words. I'm getting them into a narrow, particular approach for looking at language, where they're really paying attention to the meaning of the words. You know, what's the connotation here? And they really have to get down to that precision. But then I'm able to layer into other things. Like I've already been talking about positive politeness that we see in what Juliet does. Then also too, and this I usually do get to on the first day, is I'll start talking a little bit about rhetorical figures. So we have, so the very next one you see on the screen is polyptoton. So I have at that moment, oh, actually, if you can go back for just a second, Josivan, that's fine. You can just stay on that one. Yep, because I've got a couple more things on this one. So she starts with palm to palm. So she takes the idea of hand. She now shifts it to palm to keep within that religious circle, and then brings it into palm, and then she shifts it to palmers. So in that move from palm to palmers, that's an instance of the rhetorical figure polyptoton. And so I talked to them a little bit about how Shakespeare has these particular patterns of repetition that he studied in school. And so then I talk about those rhetorical figures, right? So again, they have another tool. It has a name, just like when we get to politeness theory. There's ways we can talk about how this exchange happens. It gives them a whole realm of tools, and it gets them to move across the kind of what sometimes ends up these days, I'd say, a little more narrow, a little more with borders. But this is literary analysis, or, you know, kind of a textual analysis without borders. So now we're bringing in politeness theory. Now we're bringing in rhetorical figures. There's another rhetorical figure in there too, the sticomythia, which is a series of one-liners. Have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Then another one-liner, I pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Sticomythia is a series of one-liners. Always happens in times of higher tension or some element of, well, yeah, that just has tension to it, right? So there's a little edge to this moment. So now when they see sticomythia and they see polyptoton, where there's a word and then some aspect of it that's still like it's cognate. They still goes back to its cognate, but it's a little bit of a different word. They now see those in other places, and they can see that wordplay. So not only is it just clever, but now they understand that it has a name, and they can begin to use that as a tool. And then the very last thing is we also have sticomythia again, which is an interesting play of that potential tension that moves us then into the couplet with take, with sake and take, and then they kiss, right? So it's just gorgeous. Okay, so now Josivan can go to the next slide, please. So those are some. Then from the more literary kind of straight literary analysis, I then also have them look at the rhyme scheme, because they also share language by how they sound together. So I just put in the rhyme scheme there. And what I did, if you'll see, there's some slashes. So it's A, B, C, and then I do a weird BD, C, BD, a little odd thing right there, because really what's happening is with that line, the very first B/D line, when mannerly devotion shows in this, that actually goes back to, it also is echoing the second and fourth line in the quatrain above. And what that's doing with the fact then, so it's almost like it's A, B, C, B has that element to it. So this is a moment, what's really clever is that Shakespeare is playing on the idea of the English sonnet. Of course, we now also call it the Shakespearean sonnet. Yeah, it's a sonnet. Sorry, I just totally jumped the gun on that one. Because he has these two quatrains, but he has them sort of also echoing a little bit back, which gets us back to the octave of the Italian sonnet. And so he's really showing, he's kind of upping the ante a little bit on how clever this is. And then, of course, if you keep looking down the page, just to the very bottom, of course, as I've already said, it's a sonnet. It gets 14 lines. There's the couplet at the end, sake, take. That's the moment, of course, appropriately, that he kisses her, right? So it's this really nice little arc of a moment that kind of gets us down into the language, where we're also layering in some of those techniques, too, of kind of analyzing poetry. We can also then look, too, at the imagery, how we have this idea, we're always cycling around the image of religion. And if we look even closer, okay, well, who's the pilgrim, who's the saint? It's also really moving us into this courtly love language, right? She's the saint. He's coming then to kind of pay respect to her, devotion to her, and so it all works with this idea of courtly love. Okay. The last thing I'll just mention that I haven't had the chance. Oh yeah, that's the mean one. Okay. I'll just mention one other, actually, if you could go back just for a moment, Josivan, that would be helpful. Just for one more thing, I want to just show you another thing that I like to do, that I do, and I don't tie it to politeness at the beginning, but I like on the first day to talk about how they actually use different pronouns. So if we just go up to, If we look at Juliet's first line, good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, we see that she uses the second person you and your, which is the deferential, right? So it's that sense of respect. It has that sense of a little bit of distance. So if we're thinking with politeness theory, there's an element of distance to that. As well as then, but it's different for when Romeo uses the pronoun back, he uses thou. So right before that sonnet there, just the third line from the end, he says, they pray grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. And so we look at the way that he actually is working to create a sense of intimacy with her and bringing her in close with that thy thou form. And so again, if we can talk about the pronoun, but we can also layer in some politeness theory. Okay, so in these particular ones, we've looked at very kind of positive politeness, lots of emphasis, but this is a technique that you can, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later. It's not just in Shakespeare, it's really everywhere. And I've done it with all kinds of different texts. But I want to share with you one more example from Shakespeare. That's The Taming of the Shrew. So Josivan, if you can go to the next one, that'd be awesome. So this one has a totally different feel to it. This is from The Taming of the Shrew, between Petruchio and Catherine. This is also the first time that these two characters have had an exchange, the first time they have met, if you will, in the play. And so here we have this particular instance, more speaking the same language. In fact, in The Taming of the Shrew, it actually has a thematic element to it. Petruchio literally works to get Catherine to speak his language. And he's very abusive, frankly. So if we look at this one, I'm not going to go through the whole series of like the circling everything, but I'll just read it out. This was a little hard not to kind of act a little bit because it's so dramatic. But look also too for the way that they speak or don't speak each other's language. And we'll do just a little bit of work with that in terms of how they do that, how they pass words back and forth, and what are some of those politeness applications. So Petruchio starts it. Good morrow, Kate, for that's your name, I hear. And she says back, well have you heard, but something hard of hearing. They call me Catherine, that do talk of me. You lie in faith, for you were called plain Kate, and bonny Kate, and sometimes Kate the Cursed. But Kate, the prettiest Kate in Christendom, Kate of Kate Hall, my super dainty Kate, for dainties are all Kates. And therefore, Kate, take this of me, Kate of my consolation, hearing thy mildness praised in every town, thy virtues spoke of, and thy beauty sounded, yet not so deeply as to thee belongs, myself am moved to woo thee for my wife. Moved? In good time. Let him that moved you hither remove you hence. I knew you at the first you were immovable. What's immovable? A joint stool. Thou hast hit it! Come, sit on me. Asses are made to bear, and so are you. Women are made to bear, and so are you. Okay, where do you start with this one? First of all, Catherine does not speak other people's language in this play. The very first time he speaks, right, he says, for your name, I hear. She picks up here. Well, have you heard? But something hard of hearing. So she picks up the word, but then she kind of morphs it and pushes it back with then that kind of attack on his positive face of that he's hard of hearing, right? So she slams it back at him. And then she corrects him. So we have this idea that he says her name is Kate. She does not speak that language. She says, no, it is Catherine. And then he goes back, I think it's like 11 more times in that next little speech that he has to say the word Kate. Bam, bam, bam. He bludgeons her with his version of her name. Extremely face-threatening act. Extremely. He just goes right at her in terms of that is not who you are. You are who I say you are. And then we get this idea of moved, right? So he says, myself am moved, as in I'm prompted, I'm inspired to woo you for my wife. She takes up the idea of moved in terms of inspired, and she uses it back as moving, literally, get out. Let him that moved you hither remove you hence. And then she says, I knew you were immovable, right? So she's playing on this idea. Lots of polyptoton as she takes and shifts this move to moved, moved, well, move to moved to movable, which is a piece of movable furniture, which then is then a joint stool. So then he uses the idea of a stool to have her then come and sit on him like one would a stool. Like, well, if I'm a stool, then come sit on me. Extremely another face-threatening act. What's particularly interesting about, if we look at the differences in how they approach it using politeness theory. I'm not a linguist, right? So some of you are either going to be far better at this, but again, it's just a useful way, at least to start getting into it, is if we look at the way that they kind of do face-threatening acts, they're very different. We see with Petruchio that he does the face-threatening act baldly at the beginning with no redressive action. I'm not saying that she does either, but what's interesting is the extremity of that face-threatening act. She does things in terms of asses are made to bear, and so are you, right? So she's calling him an ass and someone that, you know, should be bearing burdens. So that definitely is limiting his freedom. So we can talk about this idea of that kind of negative face of that negative face component. But his is so much deeper when he says women are made to bear. Now this becomes an invasive aspect in terms of her body and women's bodies, because later he actually will do some extremely sexualizing things with her that are very well, they're very disturbing. And so we see, if we look at the extremity of 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 what they say, and in those shared language moments, it kind of pops it out even more for us, and it gives us like an anchor place that we can look at. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of go through. So as I mentioned, this is not just in Shakespeare. I use this for other texts all the time. I mean, it works beautifully for drama, but it also has all these other applications that I'll kind of finish up on these last few slides to talk a little bit about. I put in Star Trek, which seems like a very strange thing, but I've taught this technique not only for kind of students in my literature classes, but one of the times I taught Shakespeare, it was for actors. It was students who were getting their BFA. So they were studying literally to be professional actors, and they were part of the Guthrie Theater, which is in Minneapolis, their program. So I was their Shakespeare teacher, and I worked with, I co-taught the class with their vocal coach. So I taught this particular technique in class. The next class, she comes back and she goes, Linda. I'm like, what? She goes, speaking the same language? It's like everywhere. I was watching Star Trek last night, and they were doing it there. I was like, yes, Virginia, it is. It's everywhere. So it's just kind of a fun thing that you really then can start hearing it kind of everywhere. And again, for those of you, who study this, you're like, well, of course. But for students, and say even from my colleague, it was like, oh my goodness, it's everywhere. So it really kind of lets them begin to see that. It's also a technique too, then I start talking about how in real life we work to speak a common language. That certainly is the language of diplomacy. That certainly is the language of persuasion. And there's some really haunting examples in Shakespeare, frankly, of persuasion, like Othello and Iago. It is absolutely terrifying to watch how Iago speaks Othello's language as a way to kind of get him to believe that, get Othello to believe that his wife Desdemona is unfaithful, which is not the case. It's absolutely haunting, and we can watch this again and again in Shakespeare. But we can watch this too in when we are in conversations, right? Discourse analysis, how this exchange works out. How does it happen sometimes on the kind of word level? And I can do this here in the literature classroom, and so that's been really fun. So I want to go to the next slide, because what I do then with students, is now I do speaking the same language without borders. So this now is at that idea of the wider application. And I tell students, because I'm really committed, as we all are, not just to their reading abilities, but also their communication skills, their written communication, their oral communication skills. So then I tell them, I said, okay, so now in your writing and your oral presentations, a key way to do this is to speak your own language, or to speak the language. So an easy example that I'll often start with is when they're doing their kind of their final essay exams, right? So they're given a prompt and then they need to answer that prompt. I'm like, okay, pay attention to the prompt. What are the words in the prompt? Then take and make sure that you layer in that language, that you speak that language of the prompt within the own keywords of your own argument. And you keep putting those next to each other, weaving it all the way through. So that way it's always clear that you're answering the prompt. When you are doing a paper, and so this is where I have a little snippet from my helpful hints to writing, is this idea, I just pulled it right from my list, about speaking your own language by using keywords. And I say one of the simplest ways to show that all your ideas work together is if you devise keywords and phrases of your topic, and then you use these words lightly throughout your paper or oral presentation, particularly in your title, your introduction, your thesis, the first few sentences of each paragraph or each new example, and your commentary. And literally when they're peer workshopping and they're looking at each other's work, I have them say, okay, so what are the keywords? I make the writer like write up what are those keywords. And then I then have them or like one of their peers looks at their paper and says, okay, so now find those keywords. And then say, okay, I mean, how many times have we read students' papers and it takes them like 3 sentences to get to their topic? Well, if you do keywords, they can see it. And so you say, where's your first keyword? Oh, looks like my 3rd sentence. So then they're like, oh, yeah. So now it's concrete. Now they just kind of make sure, like in their title and in their first sentence, boom, they have at least 1 or 2. And by the end of their thesis, I tell them all of their keywords should now be in play all together. No new keywords, just all in play. So that way there's no suddenly like rabbit out of the hat at the end. Surprise. So I have them do that, and then topic sentences and all those things so that they're speaking the same language. And it shows how each thing comes out and is tied to their argument. And I do that with oral presentations, especially group presentations. I'm like, come up with your thesis as you're working, coming up with those keywords, and then everyone in your group lightly uses that language. So you sound together. And in this day and age where most of us, like right now, are doing things virtually, it's easier even to plan virtually because you come up with that common language and then you share that language. So even if you're all joining by your computers, you have a language that you've developed together. So it's just really been for me, it's been really transformative because it gives students a very concrete way. I no longer have to tell them, make your thesis more specific, because I'm like, where are your keywords? And they can identify them. And so again, it just breaks it down into pieces, which is something that I just love about all analysis, is how we break it down into strategies, break it down into pieces. So the last thing I want to end with is just the last slide that comes very different, but I just thought I'd share it at the end. And this will be my last slide. And so I say wider application still, speaking the same language, researchers and communities. One of the things that I have been doing is using aspects of storytelling, is to how can we use storytelling as a common space for communities to bring their stories, their language, and researchers to bring their stories and their language, and we bring those stories together. And then we suddenly have locally relevant co-produced knowledge. And so I've been doing this, I've created this extremely simple, I mean, it's like underwhelming, like, wow. But I coded that, I like to say, very simple computer simulation model that works on issues of climate change, on land use practices, so it involves aspects of erosion and water pollution, and then also aspects of what's called social capital from the social sciences as relationship ties. But there's sufficient sketchiness in this that it actually then prompts individuals and communities to tell their stories. Like, for example, if you just look at our community readiness and connectedness, it's there. It just says readiness. So it's great. People are like, well, like, what makes someone ready? I'm like, you tell me. Like, what does it mean for people you know to be ready? What do you need to be ready? What are the barriers? Because every community is going to have something different, or every group within a community is going to have different needs. It's a really interesting thing to bring in underrepresented populations and to bring in their stories and their needs and their barriers and their assets. And it's been really exciting. And in terms of also, well, then who should be working together? Who should be collaborating? So this comes from the language of research. These are the things that matter in that kind of sustainable, resilient community that you heard Josivan talk about at the beginning. This like, okay, how does a Shakespeare professor do this? But it's fundamentally at how, I mean, there's other aspects of it too, but it's fundamentally a space. I've created this as a space to bring these different stories together. How do we begin to start with some common language and then begin to speak each other's language together? So I know I'm just going to end with a very different kind of thing, but just thank you for just being here in this really exciting conference and all the work that's gone into organizing it. And so now I just really turn this over to questions and thoughts that you have.
Wow, let me check just a moment, please.
That's fine.
My camera is not working. I'm just trying to reconnect it. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. We're all doing things very differently these days. I'm standing in my own house.
Okay, I will do my plan B using my cell phone camera. Okay, so thank you for your kind presentation. It was really amazing listening to you talking about Shakespeare, especially focusing on the linguistics aspect. And I will check on the channel just to check if we have any questions from our attendees. Okay, just because we have a short delay, maybe they're just watching you. But just before they ask that question, I'd like to comment more on a specific topic because all of the topics you bring into discussion make us reflect on the teaching of English as an international language or as a foreign language or as a lingua franca. And I'd like to highlight how we can design or we can adapt those strategies you talk about, for example, especially type words, so we can address or meet our students' need, especially in high school, Brazilian high schools that are beginners with English. So if you just decide to teach them English through Shakespeare plays, I think that it could be challenging not only for students but also for teachers because you face two different situations. The first one is which type of material am I going to bring to my students? The real play written by Shakespeare or a play adapted by another writer that write about Shakespeare? So your presentation highlights that we need to consider the materiality of language. And I think that literature has a kind of presence for the reader, and this presence is revealed by or the book or the kind of material used in the classroom. But because it has a materiality, we need to consider the special features that the language portrays through the narrative, through the play. So how could we engage our students to read Shakespeare, not other writers that write about Shakespeare?
A couple different things. That's a really great question. Is that we don't try to teach them the whole play. That we take in scenes, and we maybe, you know, if we need to give them a sense of the plot, sure, but we don't try to like take in the whole play. And so like taking in this particular moment with Romeo and Juliet, it works beautifully, and also in context that they sort of understand already. So I wouldn't want to necessarily throw them into like Henry IV Part 1, you know, with some kind of political, and it's interesting how they're speaking the same language or not actually in terms of kind of political leadership. I wouldn't be doing that. I would take them into something like the two examples I've done today, because they understand that sense of, you know, kind of relationships. But they also, then another really great one is when Iago and convinces Othello in Act 3, Scene 3 of gets him to believe that Desdemona, Othello's wife, is unfaithful. And so it's very simple, and the language isn't that hard. Like a lot of words that are passed back and forth are think, love, honest, proof. Very simple words. These are not complicated, but they're passed back and forth so often, so the students don't have to learn a huge range of words, really. That so there are these scenes that are absolutely perfect, and I would just start with those and just let them do that. But I actually don't support doing Shakespeare like adaptations where it's like modernized. The stories are great, sure, but what's really great is the language, the complexity of it. But then, yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with students, this is their first language. It's terrifying. In fact, my very first job, I taught at Rochester Institute of Technology, and so I had a significant cadre, and over time it got bigger a little bit, of students who were deaf, and so their first language was sign language, right? And so then I began to learn little bits of their language so that we could talk about how and they actually would do scenes at the end where they would with speaking the same language, where like with Catherine and Petruchio, have Petruchio maybe be it was really interesting. One group did it where Petruchio was the speaking character. I mean, excuse me, was hearing character. So he, whereas Catherine was deaf, and so then there were certain words then that she began to speak of his, to, you know, as he was making her be a part of his world, of his language. But it was very simple, and so I did that because those students who know ASL, English is not their first language, so already it's like a foreign language truly to them. So just finding these little ways, right, especially when we do the speaking the same language, we can boil it down to a smaller territory. We can do scenes with them, and they really like it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, your answer. Okay, your comment let me think about another point that we could experience from your presentation. That is how you deal with the language and how you deal with the sound. For example, you just not only read the material, but you also dramatize. I don't know which word we could use in English to express this kind of drama, when you read in a way that it becomes meaningful for example. So these cause a kind of this has a kind of effect on the reader. And when and if you tell your students to read, for example, a part of a play by William Shakespeare or another writer, for example, um, they have to read it in a way that the text has to be not only meaningful, but be able to cause a kind of effect on the student's body. Okay,
Yes.
so this is very important. For example, when you say, let's read this part of that play, for example, but you need to instruct the student how to read it, not only just read it. No, you need to provoke and to I don't know which word to say it, but when I was listening to your presentation, sometimes I thought that I was listening to a kind of podcast, for example, like a kind of audiobook. It was really amazing. So you read it in a way that it feels good to do it. So it's just like when you are watching the characters playing when you are reading. So I think it is a good way to teach language in an integrated way to our students because when they act, they are doing it, they are expressing speaking skills, for example, and those skills are modeling the behavior, how to behave when you speak. It shapes the pronunciation, how the intonation, how to express themselves. But they can do it in different skills, for example, in writing or reading or just when they are speaking. So, what are your perspectives on these aspects of how the written material, especially a play, for example, or a novel, a single poem, can shape the students' behavior, how they behave? Is a kind of cause and effect on, on the body, for example.
Very much so. And so I think you've hit on something that's really, I think, deeply insightful and certainly important to me, is because, like, for example, I don't think I ever would have be here today talking about Shakespeare and ended up being a scholar who works on Shakespeare if it wouldn't have been for my high school teacher who would have a group go and put on a performance of and so the very first one we did was Hamlet, and it was getting to speak it, not just read it. Because I mean, I was in an English class, I was reading Julius Caesar. Oh my goodness, if you don't know the rhetorical tradition and oratory and the speaking the same language stuff with discourse, it is a snore. So I had that and I was like, oh my goodness, never. But by speaking it, it is gorgeous to speak. And so for me, it's really important. So that's why the first day of class, they are reading together, but I do it in pairs. So that way they're not in front of each other needing to read. I have them mix up later and read again individually just with other people. I mean, with one other person. So it's very, again, safe. It's a safer space. What was I going to say? But getting them to read it, and then I do have them do film presentations where they have to look at it in interpretation, and so they bring in just little bits of film. We don't just sit and watch a whole movie, but but so they can see it actually performed really makes a big difference. But then even little, and so I'm really a believer in the speaking part of it, and sometimes it could be really interesting to have moments where we stage things also. And so just literally on Thursday, no, not Thursday, Tuesday, this past week, I had my students stage the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice. And so suddenly, like having all these bodies coming in and then getting into formation, and they played around with what's the formation of this group that are the Magnificos. So it's the Duke and the Magnificos, and so it's a trial scene, and where do we put them, and then what does that do, and then in comes our kind of main Christian character with his little entourage, and then all by himself, comes Shylock, the Jewish character. Nobody's with him. And to feel that, and then maybe to speak a little bit of the words, but again, not anything that's putting anyone out there, because this is a big group situation, but even just getting them to move in that bodied experience of some of these staging stuff can just be really like, whoa. So in fact, when I was interviewing at Iowa State, I was asked what's a main principle of your teaching philosophy? And I blurted out blood circulation. And I was like, oh my gosh, what did I just say? Blood circulation? That is not a good idea. You've got to explain that. But I talked about the fact that we need to speak it. We need to move through it, that it needs to become part, like a kinetic experience. We have a lot of kinetic learners. And so that, I think, is also part of it. But really just getting them, sometimes the language itself is going to carry them. And they're going to be able to read it, maybe not as well as, like an actor, of course, but they'll get to feel what it sounds like. So for me, it isn't always as important if it sounds like an actor saying it, but just the fact that they get to experience it is really powerful, I found. Josivan, I think you're muted. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Oops. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. My microphone was on.
It's okay.
I'm just learning about it. Okay.
It's okay.
It was an amazing answer about it. So let me check on the channel if we have any question right now. Okay. No, but there's a concept on your trial at the time of your lecture that really caught my attention. That is the concept of terrifying. Okay. So when you think of terrifying texts, for example, when I listen to you, when you see your presentation, for example, you show us that there's nothing that is terrifying in teaching Shakespeare. So, what is your message for those who believe that teaching literature and teaching language, such as grammar or something like that, can be or should be considered as a separate thing? For example, you can teach literature and at the same time focus on aspects of language, for example. And when you teach language, sometimes they use sentences from narratives, from novels, for example. So, what is your message for those that think that is terrifying teaching literature or just integrated with linguistics?
I think the answer for me is in part of the whole premise of the conference that you all have created, and that's this idea of without borders, and that we all have tools that we bring, and sometimes it's just sitting down with it and saying, where is my expertise in this? You do some sentence diagramming with some of Shakespeare's sentences, and oh my goodness, you can watch how a character is like evading something, how they're emphasizing or like slipping in something that's a little controversial maybe at the end if you diagrammed it. And so it's like, I feel we need to do that. And those of you who work on politeness theory or discourse analysis, I mean, Shakespeare is just absolutely a gorgeous field of really, I think the big thing is just to start with a small piece and just look at it and see, where is my expertise? What do I bring to this? Because I mean, it's something that, all the little things that I just brought in, I mean, I do rhetorical figures. I do, I do strategies of argumentation like commeratio and concessio. That's all from the rhetorical tradition. And then, I do a little bit. I when I do graduate courses, sometimes I'll do more like politeness theory. I need to do more with the cooperative principle. That sounds like something I probably really ought to do, but I haven't yet. But I feel like these are all these other tools. And what I love about linguistics, for example, and aspects of literature and rhetoric is that we have names for these things, right? So it isn't just, we don't just read it and go, that's really beautiful. Okay. But we can look how it's put together. And if we do that when we're doing our literature, that's going to help our students with their writing. Because when we break something down, like I tell students, I'm like, part of how I learned how to construct a really good, not just a sentence, but a good paragraph and how to read well is when I diagram sentences. Because I learned that a sentence can be broken down into parts. Just like a beautiful poem can be broken down into parts, and there's power in what are those parts. So we all know these different types of parts, and I think we can learn a great deal from each other by just sharing, well, this is what I would do with it. In my department, we haven't done it in a while, and I think that's a shame, but especially with COVID and other things. We used to call it 3-on-1. And so we'd have three different like faculty members look at a common text and each bring their different lens to it. And so that way we could see the kind of plurality of possibilities. And that I think would be a really interesting exercise, is how do we all bring these, but we all have these tools that have names that make, and that makes it be less terrifying because you can name it. You can talk about face threatening acts. You can talk about speech acts. That's a directive. They can see that, they can get it. So, and it's exciting for me, right? It's just, I love it. I guess that's kind of obvious. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think that you are tired of us, so we need to move on.
Sounds
And just let me check if we have questions. Okay. But our recording will be available on the channel so people can watch whenever they watch. And I really want to thank you for your kind presentation and to inspire us to reflect on our teaching process, on how we teach literature, especially when we think of William Shakespeare. For example, when we think of Shakespeare, we think of hard text to read. So we think of a kind of complex language, and it really is. But I think this complexity is the core of the teaching. It is the core of the beauty of language. So thank you for this opportunity and for teaching us to model our strategies. I'm really impressed in the way you read the parts of the play. For example, we can do it with our students so that they can record themselves and listen to themselves later. For example, in a podcast or in a video, for example. I think it will be very fun and very how can I say, it will be a great experience to learn the language and to improve their skills. And for ourselves as teachers, I believe that I need to improve the way I do it. So I'd like to invite you to leave your final message for our attendees, and I just want to thank you for this.
Well, you're welcome. And just, I think my final my message is really just to thank you. I mean, doing this idea of Without Borders and bringing us all together to have conversations, I think is really key, because I think we all have things to teach each other. And at the center of it is that we all are very passionate about text and language, spoken language, written language. And I think just we all bring our passions. Our students will notice, because they'll be able to see that we love it, and they'll be able to see all the different ways they can love it too, which I think is really exciting. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I just stopped the recording.